Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene the third of 5 sessions this week on the revolutionary foment that is currently seizing the nation of Iran. We have been commemorating the death of Mahsa Amini, the young Kurdish woman, age 22, who was beaten to death by the morality police on the 16th of September. And last week marked the 40th day after her death. We have convened this in solidarity with the young women and all the people that are working for the replacement of the regime in Iran. And we are seeking through our broadcast this week to shed light on a number of very important factors. This is a unique revolutionary impulse because this is the only event, at least that I know about, and many people, where it is the young women that are really catalyzing events. And in many ways, even though there's no discernible leader in what's happening in Iran, it's the young women that have been at the forefront in taking off their hijab. And that has inspired, and it has really opened up a opportunity in that country and globally to replace this current regime with something that antedates Islam and antedates the mullahs, and that is to go back to the nation of Persia. And what I would like to just touch on in just a few minutes as we begin this program is to call up some of the aspects of the Persian Empire and the Persian civilization through its founder, Cyrus the Great. As it turned out, the 40th death day of Mahsa Amini fell on the day each year that Iranians honor Cyrus the Great. And I think that synchronicity is important to observe because both in antiquity and in modernity, historians have pointed to Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, as a king of kings, someone who embodied the essence of leadership and the essence of governance and diplomacy in such a unique way that the model that he historicized has inspired leaders to the present day. And I would like to just tell just very, very briefly one story that not only demonstrates his military and strategic genius, but the kind of diplomacy and open-heartedness and generosity of spirit that he demonstrated virtually throughout his reign that lasted from 559 to 530 BC. When he came to power, he was in a very small little nation of Parsis right at the top of the Persian Gulf. Arrayed across the Middle East were the Medes and the Lydians and the Neo-Babylonians. And in very short order, he was able to conquer and absorb Media, and therefore you often hear of the Medes and the Persians. He conquered Lydia, and then in about 540, he turned his sights onto Babylon. This is a very famous story that many people, particularly in the biblical tradition, understand. But the king of Babylonia was a man named Nabonius, and he had a son named Belteshazzar. And Nabonius was a harsh king. When he saw that Cyrus was mobilizing his forces he seized the sacred objects of many of the conquered people around Babylonia and brought them into Babylon so he could be empowered by their gods and goddesses. And this caused great consternation. But Babylon was virtually impregnable. It was massive. It had walls, double walls, over 80 feet high. The Euphrates River flowed around it, so it had great moats. And it was considered in its time to be able to withstand any kind of siege. So here you have Cyrus contemplating how to conquer this great city. And this is the genius of Cyrus. He convened his council of generals, understood that the city was not conquerable as a direct assault. So he did something very surprising. First, he took part of his army and put it at the headwaters of the Euphrates, right north of Babylon. And then another force to the south of Babylon, where the Euphrates left and emptied into the Persian Gulf. And this confused the Babylonians. Then he took all the able-bodied people who weren't soldiers north to a part of the Euphrates where decades before, the Babylonians had built a basin during one of the years when the Euphrates had flooded in an unusually high flooding. And he reassembled that basin and diverted the Euphrates into the basin, which lowered the river as it flowed under the walls of Babylon. And secondly, he chose his date very carefully because the night that he diverted the river was a festival of music and heavy drinking among the Babylonians. And I wanted to just emphasize this because his son, Belteshazzar, was in full revelry, believing that Babylon could not be assaulted in that time by any army. And this is an important story because in his drunken revelry, as you remember, for those of you who know the Old Testament, an invisible hand wrote on the wall where they were feasting that you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. The Persian troops came in through the Euphrates River, and by morning, Belteshazzar was dead. The Babylonians had surrendered. And Cyrus was heralded and received into Babylon as a great conqueror and a great liberator because he took those gods and goddesses and gave them back to the people from which Nabonidus had taken them. And one of the great acts of generosity, as we know from the biblical tradition, is Cyrus said to the Jews that had been held in captivity there by the Babylonians for 70 years, that they could go back to Palestine, to Israel. And he gave them the money and the charter to build their temple anew. And in this one little story, you see the strategic genius of Cyrus. You also see the generosity of spirit and his tolerance and his respect for local customs and his respect for diversity and empowering the people that he conquered to be as free as they were possible to be in an imperial system such as it was in deep antiquity. So that is the part of the legacy of Persia. And if you think about what's going on in Iran today with the mullahs and the harshness and the coerciveness and the fundamentalism and the absolute refusal to allow any kind of democratic impulse or any kind of civil liberties or human rights, it's the antithesis of the civilization out of which Iran emerged. And the fact that it is young women at this time that are catalyzing the revolutionary fervor that is destined, I believe, to bring down that regime. It is really to open up the way to a reclamation of the Persian civilizational culture with all of its elegance that really represents what Iran should be. So with those few comments, I want to thank Banafsheh Sayyad, who has been convening this week and bringing the events in Iran to our attention. Banafsheh, you've done an extraordinary job, and I turn the program over to you for our opening meditation and intention.
Thank you so much, Jim. Hello to everyone. Thank you for illuminating the Persian legacy, Jim. Welcome to everyone to the third day of Woman, Life, Freedom Summit on Iran, where we are aiming to understand what is happening in Iran by listening to different perspectives, the voices on this liberation movement. In yesterday's session, Dr. Maryam Sayyad educated us about the women-led revolution we are witnessing in Iran and what gave rise to it from a profound sociopolitical as well as mythic lens. You can read her article based on this presentation in the November issue of Eden magazine on the edenmagazine.com. I will share the link later. The revolution in Iran is a grassroots movement consisting of different groups across the country without a centralized leadership. The people don't have guns. Their weapon is their voice, their courage, their unity, the refusal to be intimidated. And for the women and the girls, it is the reclaiming of their bodies, letting their hair free, taking off their hijab, and wearing what they want in public, which they have not been allowed to do so for the last 40 some years. Will these tactics help them triumph and overthrow the Islamic Republic, which is their wish, which is our wish? What else is needed? These are the questions that come up in light of the regime's brutal crackdown on the people, on its own citizens. The criminal Islamic Republic is heavily armed and not afraid to beat, shoot, and kill its own people. They have been attacking schools, prisons, beating children and prisoners to death. They have stormed people's homes, vandalized their vehicles, and blamed all of that on the protesters. More than 14,000 protesters are known to have been arrested with either no or minimal contact with their family, and hundreds have been killed, many under the age of 18, after being sexually abused and raped. All of them innocent, unarmed, simply asking for a better life, for their basic human rights. Some are doctors who attended to the injured protesters, attorneys who have spoken up on behalf of the protesters, journalists who have reported on protests, and school teachers who have refused to turn in school kids, who have taken down images of the supreme leader Ali Khamenei, the arch criminal. The regime has denied any wrongdoing and continues to cover up their slaughter, claiming the deceased have died of natural causes or jumped off buildings. In some cases, they have refused to turn the body of the deceased to their families, whom they have forced to either remain silent or give false confessions about how their child, sister, brother, mother, or father died or faced dire consequences. Let me add that the authorities closed the roads to the shrine of Cyrus the Great, so people couldn't visit it to commemorate this great king and the pride of our tradition on Cyrus the Great Day, as has been customary. As today is the Day of the Dead, All Souls Day, I invite us to gaze upon some of the faces of those who have been recently killed for freedom in remembrance of their heroism. Can you please share this slide with us?
Convener.
May their souls be blessed. We will never forget. And as we look at their faces, you're listening to the song Baraye, which means for, by Shervin
برای
Haji Pur.
توی کوچه رقصیدن، برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن، برای خواهرم، خواهرت، خواهرامون، برای تغییر مغزها که پوسیدن، برای شرمندگی، برای بیپولی، برای حسرت یک زندگی معمولی، برای کودک زباله‌گرد و آرزوهاش، برای این اقتصاد دستوری، برای این هوای آلوده، برای ولیعصر و درختای فرسوده، برای پیروز و احتمال انقراضش، برای سگهای بیگناه ممنوعه، برای گریه های بیوقفه، برای تصویر تکرار این لحظه، برای چهره ای که میخنده، برای دانش آموزا، برای آینده، برای این بهشت اجباری، برای نخبه های زندانی، برای کودکان افغانی، برای این همه برای غیر تکراری، برای این همه شعارهای تو خالی، برای آوار خونه های پوشالی، برای احساس آرامش، برای خورشید پس از شبای طولانی، برای قرصای اعصاب و بیخوابی، برای مرد میهن آبادی، برای دختری که آرزو داشت پسر بود، برای زن زندگی آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی.
Thank you, thank you. This song has become the anthem of this revolution, sang from the streets of Tehran to the streets of Los Angeles. Shireen Hajipur was arrested for this song and freed after being forced to give a false public confession. As Mariam said yesterday, this song, this anthem is about what we are for, not against. So before I turn to our panelists with the question, will the nonviolent tactics of these revolutionaries help them triumph and overthrow the Islamic Republic? I invite our group to revisit the intention we set on Monday to hold the light of certainty that the people of Iran will free themselves of this government that does not serve its people, and do so as peacefully as possible, beaming our love and light and strength and protection to the girls and boys, women and men in Iran who are standing up for freedom, autonomy, and justice, not just for themselves, but for a whole nation, for the world, without fear for their lives. So I ask you to please sit comfortably, sensing the ground lovingly with both feet. Relax and release your weight onto whatever you're sitting on. Maintain a vertical posture with ease, letting your torso lift and elongate without tension as much as possible. And rest the back of your hands on your lap. And for those of you who are joining Humanity Rising for the first time, we will be doing the coherent breathing practice to begin with. That has been a ritual on Humanity Rising for a while now. The slow nasal breathing that devotes 5.5 seconds for the inhalation and 5.5 seconds for the exhalation, that brings a balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic aspects of the autonomic nervous system. The bells we will hear will indicate when to inhale and when to exhale. As you can see here, taking this image, the 5-petaled flower created from the dance of Earth and Venus orbiting the sun. And please close your eyes and let your breathing bring you into presence, into a sense of peace and spaciousness. Please remain in this inner space and continue breathing deeply, slowly. And come in touch with your heart. Feel that you're breathing in and out of your heart. Expanding your heart space with your inhalation. And as you exhale, relaxing into sensing your body, your heart. I invite you to visualize someone you love as you sense your heart. And let this love fill your heart. Let it enliven your whole body. Feel this love as a beautiful golden light or a green light. The color emitted, the color of light emitted in and by the heart chakra. Let this light grow and expand as you breathe. As you breathe in the precious life force. And with your exhalation, see the light spread out into the environment around you. Now let's connect our hearts. Connect your heart with the hearts of those gathered together today on this call from different parts of the world. Feel how as you merge the light of your heart with the rest of us into one heart, you feel more expansiveness in your own heart and body. Let us expand the light and thereby dissolve that which is not love, that which does not affirm life, like the Islamic Republic. Will you join me in holding the light of certainty that the people of Iran will free themselves of this government that does not serve its people, and do so as peacefully as possible. Keeping alive the light of certainty that they will triumph, that it has already happened. Envision what this triumph looks like and what it feels like in your heart, in your body. This is no less than freedom, justice, and peace, permeating our whole world starting from the ancient land of Persia, in the name of love. Amen. Amen. And so it is. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. I'd like to now turn to our panelist, Dr. Stephen Zunes, Professor of Politics and International Studies at the University of San Francisco, where he served as founding director of the program in Middle Eastern Studies. Recognized as one of the country's leading scholars of U.S. Middle East policy and of strategic nonviolent action, Professor Zunes has served as a senior policy analyst for foreign policy in focus project of the Institute for Policy Studies, an associate editor of Peace Review, and a contributing editor of Tikkun. He's the author of hundreds of articles for scholarly and general readership on Middle Eastern politics, U.S. foreign policy, international terrorism, nuclear non-proliferation, strategic nonviolent action, and human rights. He is the principal editor of Nonviolent Social Movements, the author of the highly acclaimed Tinderbox, U.S. Middle East Policy and the Roots of Terrorism, and co-author of Western Sahara, War, Nationalism, and Conflict, E-Resolution. Welcome, Dr. Zunes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me and for your inspirational work. I want to talk about the 2019 pro-democracy revolution in Sudan, which, despite recent setbacks, can be something of a model to the ongoing freedom struggle in Iran. Like Iran, Sudan had for decades been under the repressive rule of ultra-conservative Islamists and a repressive military security apparatus. And I'm happy to talk about the ongoing Iranian struggle in the discussion that follows. I want to focus my remarks on the research on Sudan, which you can find in the link that I just posted in the chat. It's a free download. Iran, of course, has a long tradition of civil resistance. You know, the tobacco strike in the 1890s, the constitutional revolution the following decade, the uprising against the Shah in the late 1970s, and the impressive, unsuccessful uprisings against the Islamic Republic in 2009 and other occasions. And similarly, Sudan had a history of successful unarmed insurrections in their independent struggle against Britain in the 1950s, and the pro-democracy struggles against the Ayyub dictatorship in 1964 and the Numeri dictatorship in 1985. The most impressive uprising, however, began in late 2018 and culminated in the ouster of the brutal regime of General al Bashir the following year. And that's what I want to focus on. I mean, it's perhaps fitting that one of the greatest stories of the power of nonviolent resistance came out of a country that notorious for decades of horrific state-sanctioned violence, or that women would take such an impressive leadership in the revolution in a country known for its particularly misogynistic laws, or that there could be such unity in a country that was long divided by religion, ethnicity, and religion, or that there could emerge an impressive level of participation by a population systematically disempowered through decades of dictatorship. The scenes of millions of Sudanese out in the streets during the waves of protest over an 18-month period in 2018, 2019, it demonstrated a triumph not just of the human spirit, but some of the most brilliant strategic thinking of any social movement in history. Sudan didn't, fit into what some Western analysts would see as conditions necessary for a pro-democracy civil resistance movement. I mean, this regime had been in power for nearly 30 years. It was nearly as long as the Islamic Republic. It was widely seen as too oppressive, too entrenched, too successful in its divide and rule tactics of this large and ethnically heterogeneous nation to be vulnerable to civil insurrection. Their reactionary limitations in women's rights had seemingly disempowered half the population. The country's once vibrant civil society had been decimated under the 3 decades of military rule, and the Sudanese are seen as too impoverished, uneducated, and isolated to mobilize successfully. Millions of the country's most educated and ambitious potential leaders had emigrated. And most of the West had largely written off Sudan as a hopeless case, with a number of countries maintaining strict sanctions on Sudan that hurt the people more than the government. Now, at least some of these things may sound familiar to those of you who are concerned about Iran. But it was Sudan's civil society organizations, particularly labor unions, that played a critical role in the successful pro-democracy uprisings against the military dictatorships in 1964 and 1985 in Sudan. But with unions and other independent organizations, ranging from human rights groups, the Rotary Club, suppressed by the regime, organizing was extremely challenging. The independent business sector was limited as well, with the government making it difficult to run a successful company unless it was clearly pro-regime. And opposition political parties were severely restricted in their activities, and the older, more established parties had little credibility or support among younger Sudanese. But despite this, starting in December of 2018, Sudanese citizens took to the streets in face of severe repression. And by April 2019, al-Bashir had been overthrown by fellow military officers who had come under mounting pressure from millions of irrepressible protesters. Now, protests for change continued despite hundreds of civilian deaths, and by August, the military stepped down to make way for a civilian-led transitional government. Unfortunately, lack of support by the United States and other countries of the civilian-led government made it difficult to address the economic crisis, a legacy of decades of misrule by the Bashir regime. And in October of last year, the military again seized power. Nonviolent resistance has resumed, however, and it has essentially become a stalemate, with the military the resistance has been unable to rule, but the military regime has been unable to fully consolidate power either. It's its ongoing struggle. I want to focus on the 2019 revolution, however, because there's some important lessons that those currently struggling for freedom in Iran and elsewhere could learn. A critical factor was the scope and scale of the movement. Unlike some civil insurrections, which were almost exclusively in the nation's capital and with mostly middle-class support, the Sudanese Revolution took place all over the country, in all different regions, with diverse class and ethnic participation. Professional associations played a key leadership role, but popular resistance committees were also active in even the poorest neighborhoods. Indeed, the ability to build such a broad coalition of forces was vitally important given the size and complexity of the country. Now, for decades, the regime had tried to divide Sudanese by North and South, Arab and non-Arab, Muslim and non-Muslim. And the pro-democracy protesters recognized that national unity was critically important and consciously resisted efforts to divide and rule. For example, though historically in the Arab-dominated part of Sudan, Greater Khartoum is a multi-ethnic urban area, as those from minority regions fleeing violence and poverty had flocked to the capital area. When the protests began, the regime tried to blame the uprising on Furs, the indigenous people indigenous to the Darfur region who had been subjected to a genocidal campaign by the regime. In response, the largely Arab but multi-ethnic protesters began chanting, "We are all Darfur." And in solidarity in Al Bashir, the Darfur capital, they started chanting, "We are all Khartoum." A second really important factor was the commitment to strategic nonviolent action. The security force defections, the breadth and depth of the movement, the role of women, and the tactical innovations all played a critical role, as did support from the international community, the Sudanese diaspora, and key business leaders. These factors would not likely have come into play were it not for the strict commitment to nonviolent strategies and tactics insisted upon the movement leadership. And this included nonviolence training and the enforcement of nonviolent discipline at the nonviolent discipline at the protest. This made it very difficult for the regime to claim these people were terrorists. It made it very difficult for people who are traumatized by years of violence to say, "Oh no, we can't risk having more violence." I mean, yes, there's violence coming down from the regime, to be sure. Hundreds of people were killed. But the strict nonviolent discipline gave a lot more sympathy to the resistance than would have been otherwise possible. A third principle was that poverty and poor infrastructure is not an obstacle to a successful nonviolent revolution. It challenges the myth that civil resistance cannot work in impoverished countries with high literacy rates and poor infrastructure. I mean, Sudan is one of the poorest countries in the world, exacerbated by rampant corruption, drought, and the lack of adequate transport and other basic infrastructure. Its literacy rate is among the lowest in the Arab world. It ranks near the bottom in the Human Development Index. Despite this, millions of people successfully mobilized across the country. And another interesting point, is that in the debate among social movement theorists regarding the relative importance of structural factors versus agency and condition, structural factors versus agency and conditions versus skills, the case of Sudan seems to underscore the importance of skills and agency. I mean, Sudan was seen as a hopeless case in terms of democratic change due to the powerful coalition of conservative Islamists and military officers, the weakness of the opposition, the degree of oppression, ethnic division, poverty, poor infrastructure. It failed to meet the standard criteria for democratic change by traditional theorists of democracy. Yet millions of Sudanese civilians were nevertheless able to organize, mobilize, and follow through to oust the old regime and bring about, at least for a time, a civilian-led government. A fifth factor important to recognize is decentralization, because the decentralization of the protests ensured high levels of participation by enabling people who do not have to travel great distances. And by spreading the actions out too widely to be easily suppressed, they became relatively low risk, thereby encouraging even greater numbers. And participation can provide a sense of ownership of a movement. And data has shown that numbers can be a critical variable in the success of an insurrection. The flexibility and willingness to shift and diversify nonviolent tactics as needed prevented the movement from stagnating and kept the regime struggling to find new ways to respond. A sixth point I want to point out is that it was a balance of organizational leadership and grassroots activism. And part of the credit goes to the movement for having both the strong leadership of the Sudanese Professionals Association and other establishment opposition groups, which could coordinate the resistance on a national level, and the resistance committees in the neighborhoods and villages at the grassroots level. The Sudanese appear to have found the right balance between effective organizational leadership providing overall direction and strategy and more spontaneous direct action oriented by youth, such as in the resistance committees. Another factor is, of course, the persistence in the face of severe repression. And it's long been assumed, despite scores of autocratic governments being ousted through civil resistance movements, that nonviolent strategies and tactics simply cannot work against highly repressive regimes. Sudan, however, has long been ranked among the half-dozen most violent totalitarian regimes in the world. Bashir has been indicted by the International Criminal Court on multiple counts of genocide, crimes against humanity, other war crimes, and top military leaders have been implicated as well. Pro-democracy activists were gunned down in the streets of Khartoum and other cities. Yet the protests continued. Finally, their related factor is their ability to respond to disproportionate violence by escalating the nonviolence. You know, there have been some noted cases of mass killings of nonviolent protesters, like at China's 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, in which the movement gave up, or South Africa's 1960 Sharpeville massacre, in which the movement shifted to armed struggle. By contrast, the escalation in violent repression by the Sudanese regime led to an escalation of the nonviolent resistance. By succeeding in a struggle against a literally genocidal regime, the Sudanese have demonstrated that few pro-democracy activists can use the excuse that their government is too repressive to contemplate nonviolent resistance. The Sudanese recognize that the most powerful weapons against extreme violence are organized and strategically directed nonviolent mobilization and actions. You're essentially choosing a different weapon system. You cannot fight the regime where it's strongest in terms of violence. This is comparable to jujitsu or aikido, you know, where you use the weight, the strength of the opponent against them. So, you know, given its size and significance, the Sudanese Revolution did not receive as much media coverage in the United States and some other countries as it deserved. Perhaps because the idea of an Arab people, a Muslim people, and African people having agency, thinking strategically, and effectively utilizing nonviolent action simply does not fit into the Western narrative. That should not stop activists and others from learning from the Sudanese, however. Given the enormous obstacles to a successful revolution that the people of Sudan were nevertheless able to overcome, the pro-democracy struggle in Sudan should serve as an inspiration, you know, for the Iranians and for people struggling for freedom elsewhere. I mean, if it could happen there, it could happen almost anywhere. Again, if you want to find some details about the revolution and, you know, my analysis and lessons from it, you can find it in the link that I posted on the chat. And I'll end here and return to the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for bringing the lessons from Sudan to us. I felt that it was very important to ask you to speak about Sudan as an inspiration for the freedom fighters in Iran, and to give them more tools and to really support what they're doing with lessons from Sudan. But I want to ask you to please also talk to us about how you see the situation in Iran. Of course, the society of Iran is very different from Sudan, but still there are many overlaps. Obviously, people are facing a tyrannical regime that is brutal and using violence against its own people and having oppressed its people for so many years. How do you see the situation in Iran, and what is your message to the freedom fighters of Iran?
Well, I've been very impressed with with what I've seen in many cases. The fact that this is like the Sudanese revolution taking place across class lines, across ethnic and regional lines, that that they have brought together a broad cross section of the of Iranian society. And they and it is I think I'm not confident that that they will be victorious this round, but I think it's very possible, and it certainly shows, in my view, that the regime's days are numbered. That what's really critical here on one level is that the ideological hegemony of the regime is gone. People just don't believe it. I mean, even people who believe in theory there should be an Islamic Republic realize that the current regime is neither. That it is a self-perpetuating corrupt elite that really sees its own power and control more important than the benefit of the people. And so what is needed, I think, is a continued mobilization. And while I do understand the frustration and anger that the people have, which have led to street fighting and the like, and I do believe that a greater nonviolent discipline would help. That I don't see this from I'm not a strict pacifist. I'm not saying this in terms of trying to a Gandhian or I'm not saying this as a part of a moral and ethical argument. I'm looking at this as a strategic analyst, and that in order to win over segments of Iranian society that are may be on the fence, that they may not like the regime, but they're not sure if they want to support the opposition, or they believe that maybe a few reforms here and there can make a difference. You don't really have to change the whole system. There are definitely some segments of society that need to win over to the cause, or even if they're sympathetic but passive, get them to be more actually active in the opposition. And usually what we found is there's greater the nonviolent discipline, the greater the numbers. You're much more likely to go out to the streets and protest, even bringing your family, if it's going to be if the movement is going to use nonviolent tactics. Similarly, you are the percentage of women involved, which is critical for success for a movement, increases and the resilience seems to be a lot higher. So and it also encourages security force defections. Riot police and others are more likely to refuse to shoot into crowds, or at least shoot over heads of people who are being nonviolent than people who are throwing projectiles at them or engaging in similar tactics. I think that I do think that what we're what makes it a little difficult, of course, is for as an American, the fact is that the United States, supported the Shah's regime, for many years, which also was brutally oppressive. We actually, played a critical role in overthrowing the last democratic government in Iran back in 1953. The United States is the biggest supporter of the repressive dictatorships in the region, like Saudi Arabia and UAE and others, and Egypt, and we support the Israeli occupation. So the Americans are in a kind of a hard position, saying, "Oh, we want freedom in Iran," given our role in supporting repression elsewhere in the region. Also, the fact that the United States, has threatened military action against Iran. We've in recent years we've invaded the country on Iran's immediate east and immediate west. And that enables the regime to use kind of a nationalist card. Iranians, of course, are very proud of their heritage, their nation, and so threats from the outside and hypocritical finger wagging from Western imperialist powers, unfortunately, does not help the movement. But at the same time, that shouldn't stop individuals from working in solidarity and support. and to emphasize, I think that despite the regime's efforts to try to portray this movement as being some kind of conspiracy from the United States or Israel or Britain or whatever. I mean, reminds me of like during the Cold War, the U.S. insisted every leftist uprising was some conspiracy hatched by the Soviets, and in both cases denying agency to the people who are struggling. That I think is important for the movement to really be able to embrace the history and the values and the culture and the things that make people proud to be Iranians, and to not trust the outside governments necessarily have the best intentions for the Iranian people. So to still embrace that kind of agency. And again, the stuff that I mentioned around Sudan, about the balance between leadership and decentralization, the importance of using a diversity of nonviolent tactics. It's not just street demonstrations and using the power of boycott, strikes. I mean, you think of the things that brought down the Shah's regime, and some of the key factors, were, for example, the strike by the oil workers and the customs workers. I mean, those were the final things that really brought the Shah down. This is more difficult now because, of course, you have these Islamic committees, infiltrating the oil workers' unions. The customs workers are part of the Revolutionary Guard. And what's difficult, the challenge I think about Iran is in certain ways that this is the first government challenged by massive civil resistance that came to power as a result of massive civil resistance. So in certain ways, they're smarter than other governments in countering it. But that just means that the movement needs to be smarter still, and to and that again, street demonstrations aren't enough. Boycott, strikes, non-cooperations, forming alternative institutions. There are hundreds of tactics that can be used, and so I think that's another thing that I would mention.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Very, very important what you said about how this government is aware of all the ways that people could resist them and overthrow them, because that's how they came to power. That's a very, very keen point that you've brought up. But I wanted to ask you that how, when the government officials shoot at people who are protesting non-violently, they're beating women who just have taken off their hijab. So they're as much as possible trying to keep. I mean, their protests are peaceful. They're just chanting. Yes, we've seen some instances of struggle, but they're really defending themselves. The protesters, the people who have risen up, have, for the most part, they're unarmed. For the most part, they haven't been using weapons. They just don't have them either.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to say when you said that to really show the rest of the nation that their movement is nonviolent. I think they are doing that.
Oh yeah. Yes, there's also been it has been overwhelmingly nonviolent. There has been some rioting and things like that. And again, I'm not making moral judgments against those who do, but again, thinking strategically. Unfortunately, movements are often depicted at the as their most violent component. The fact is, and tragically, when you're engaged in struggle against a repressive regime, that people are going to die, and they're going to be martyrs. But in general, nonviolent struggles, there are far less people being killed. And again, the data shows they're more successful. I mean, we've in an empirical study that looked at 350 or more pro-democracy struggles going back for the past 120 years. They found that armed struggles were successful 26% of the time, whereas nonviolent struggles, predominantly nonviolent struggles, were successful 53% of the time, more than twice as likely to succeed. But just as like just as an armed movement is not going to succeed, by immediately having a frontal attack on the Capitol, or engaging in a guerrilla strike in the same place, day after day after day, there needs to be they need to be strategic, initial low risk operations, hit and run operations, build cadres, in the rural areas, and sort of, work your way up. And similarly, you need to think about the sequencing of tactics and other things. I just posted a link to the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, where they have a lot of literature, including some in Farsi, that talks about what to think of in terms of organizing strategically, and the kind of things to think about in this in this regard. But we've seen so many cases where people have been again, including Sudan, where people were gunned down about by the hundreds, and yet they kept on going. And they kept persisting. You see, ultimately, no regime can stay in power without the consent of the people. That you have to actually have police and soldiers who are willing to do the violence. That you need to win them over. Mm-hmm. And you need to encourage defections in the security forces, the security forces, and. Now, this doesn't, when I say defections, this doesn't mean necessarily they're going to tear off the uniforms and join the other side. I mean, sometimes that happens. It's great when it does, but it can mean things like shooting over people's heads. It means a district commander losing an order. It means somebody in the bureaucracy erasing a file, or a computer file, or losing a memo, or whatever. That there are a lot of forms of non-cooperation that, again, you don't see in the media. You don't. Again, it's not just what happens on the streets. It's a multifaceted kind of struggle.
And how did in Sudan, how did they achieve a consensus that their resistance was going to be nonviolent and remain nonviolent? I'm sure there were factions who wanted to use arms. And how did they achieve that consensus?
I think largely because it was a strategic decision. They saw that the regime had far more resources from a violent direction, and they did not. So again, this was not a commitment to pacifism or nonviolence, on a moral or religious grounds. This was, again, a strategic decision. Just as like a guerrilla army will not use a frontal attack, on a battlefield, but use more, hit and run, hidden kind of tactics. Similarly, I mean, in certain ways, nonviolent struggle is the ultimate asymmetrical warfare. That when you're against a powerful opponent, you want to use asymmetrical warfare, because you can't, meet them on their own terms. One thing I write in the monograph, which I posted earlier, was, for example, when they occupied the area in front of the military headquarters, they actually would screen. They had checkpoints where they made sure people weren't bringing in projectiles. They actually did trainings and tactics of nonviolent resistance, and they really pushed this. And interestingly, they were government provocateurs who tried to mix in with the group and tried to provoke them to make violence, because the regime wanted them to use violent tactics, because that would give them an excuse for more repression. And so so if anybody was, for example, moving into any kind of leadership, they would, for example, take their photo and put it on the internet and says, hey, do you recognize this person? Is this guy a legitimate activist, or are they a government agent? And so, they would screen people and check on their their affiliations, and if they found that there are any questions, no, you're not in leadership. And similarly, if people start to get hot-headed, you get people who surround them, put themselves between them and the security forces, saying, "Hey, no, nope, not this." And so a lot of it had to do with just the peer pressure that and vigilance. And just like in any movement, you have to have discipline. Whether it be an armed struggle, an electoral campaign, or a nonviolent struggle, you need to be smart. You need to be disciplined, and you need to agree on strategies and tactics.
Yes, yes. And my other question for you is, you spoke about Iranians focusing on the resistance themselves and not looking outside of the country. What happened in Sudan, where was there support from other countries?
Not much from other countries, but what was important was the support from the Sudan diaspora. And here's another parallel with Iran. I think proportionally, Iran and Sudan probably have a larger, not just a larger diaspora, but an educated diaspora, a diaspora that still, even if they're many years or even a generation or two away from their country, still care about it, still have connections, still want to see freedom. And this is a great resource that the Iranian Revolution has. Obviously I've worked with activists, Iranian American activists, and they range from liberals to monarchists to moderate Islamists to the Tudeh party to there's been a huge gap, and they may not agree on a lot of things, including what a future Iran should necessarily look like, but they are willing to work together and to support the resistance. And I think despite the efforts of censorship by the regime, that the internet and other means of getting through and providing resources, and there are a number of organizations like the like the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, which I just gave the link to, and other groups. They have done they have actually done online seminars on nonviolent resistance and strategies and tactics and things like that. So I'm saying don't trust outsiders. I'm talking more in terms of governments that might have a geopolitical agenda. Certainly the Iranian exile community can be a wonderful resource, as well as some of these capacity building organizations like ICNC and others.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you for all that you've shared with us. Will you speak also to us about Tunisia and how the Iranian freedom fighters can learn from the Tunisians and what they were able to achieve in their uprising?
Tunisian revolution, unfortunately, has also had something of a setback with the president, albeit democratically elected, suspending parliament and the like, though also it's not nearly as bad as it was previously under the Ben Ali regime. There are certain parallels in terms of the massive numbers of resistance. And it's interesting that Ben Ali fled not because he wasn't ready to do desperate things to stay in power, but because he didn't have a choice. I mean, he actually ordered his troops to clear by whatever means necessary, including massacre, the hundreds of thousands of people that had massed on Bourguiba Avenue, the main drag in downtown Tunis, the capital. And his officers refused to follow through in his orders, in part because they knew that as the soldiers would not likely obey. And if anything, they turned their guns the other direction from the officers if they were ordered to do so. And it's kind of underscored that the regime is only as powerful as the people's willingness to obey it. The problem is Iran is a more complicated situation because, in general, whether you use armed struggle or nonviolent struggle or whatever, an authoritarian state where it's mostly one-man rule, like Ben Ali, is tougher, or Mubarak for that matter, or it's much more difficult than a government, a regime where there is more of an oligarchy, or is more of a broader coalition of people in power. And this is what we see, in Iran, with the Revolutionary Guard leadership, with the mullahs, with the president, with you have it's a bigger challenge. I mean, Sudan was somewhat that way. I mean, Bashir was actually obviously the strong man, but he had the military, he had the Islamists, he had a lot of folks there who were keeping the regime in power. But so again, I think Sudan's probably a better parallel than Tunisia. I mean, ultimately the state proved relatively weak. Compared to Sudan or Iran, but again, it just kind of underscores this idea that in non-cooperation and a willingness to resist the regime's demands, is critical, and effectively making it impossible for the system to continue.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, yes. Right now, hundreds of thousands of people are protesting, but it hasn't gotten to the millions mark,
Mm-hmm.
And I think this was a very important point that you were illustrating in regards to Sudan. Large numbers persisted.
And what's also, but also it often will come in waves. When you think about the revolution against the Shah, it grew often in 40-day periods, following the morning of the latest rounds of martyrs. Indeed, a lot of these struggles, I mean, the news cameras only come in when you do have the millions, but the movements will they will tend to grow over time, especially again if you can use ways to encourage participations, and again, like strikes and boycotts. I mean, that's a critical piece, because those are relatively low risk, because you're not out on the street confronting the soldiers, but you're also withdrawing support from the regime, giving a message that, hey, we don't like this current situation, and who's to prove that if someone doesn't show at work they weren't sick or something, right? The one way to expand the numbers is to use tactics that are relatively lower risk, that can include large numbers of people, and that can bring people into the movement, and more likely to then join in the more direct action kinds of tactics.
Yeah, we're only in the 47th day of this movement, so it's still young. But it sounds to me like we will be needing leadership to organize these kinds of strikes and boycotts that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So hopefully these are the next steps. So I want to thank you again for sharing so many lessons with us and guiding the freedom fighters in Iran. I'm going to ask Jim to also step in and ask you if you have any questions, any comments, Jim.
Yes, thank you, Banafsheh. Steve, that was just an extraordinary discourse on geopolitics and the nature of civil resistance. And I want to just thank you for it and acknowledge your mastery of that region and the intricacies of social change. And I think I wanted to just focus on your observation that the symmetry between now and 44 years ago is both the regime that's oppressing and its origins were mass uprisings. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, as you understand that original uprising in 1978, 79, what did the Iranian resistance then do successfully that the protesters now could learn from? because they're dealing, as you indicated, with a regime that did it masterfully. Because I can remember back in those days, we were astonished at the millions of people that were mobilized to such an extent that the Shah just flew off. I mean, there wasn't even
and let's remember the Shah's regime was very heavily armed. It was They buying tens of billions of dollars of arms from the United States and
what did
those
they
countries.
do then
The Savak was just very thorough. In fact, one of the tragedies, just let me mention this as an aside before I answer your question, is that because the Savak was so effective at killing, jailing, or forcing into exile the more progressive and nationalist and secular opposition, was the one area they couldn't totally eliminate was inside the mosques. So when the regime fell, the one group that had the had the leadership, social networks, that kind of thing, to really embrace power were the Islamists, were the mullahs, and because that's a lot of Americans. The one thing about the Shia tradition, of course, is that I try to explain this to Americans. That is that the Ayatollahs are kind of like cardinals or archbishops in the Catholic Church. That they're not just religious leaders; they have a whole network of educational institutions, medical facilities, social service organizations. They had the organization that could fill in that vacuum. Similar things seem to have happened in Iraq after the overthrow of Saddam. So it was that kind of they were able to take advantage of that of the dearth of more secular progressive organization leadership to consolidate power in a particularly repressive way shortly after the Shah's overthrow. But the movement itself, despite the unfortunate direction that the post-revolutionary Iranian society became, was quite impressive. And I think part of it was the persistence that in the face of the massacres, that they kept on coming. I think it was the fact that they were it was not just in Tehran, but even in smaller towns and cities, perhaps across the country. And I think, as I noted earlier, the unions played a major role. The strikes that made it. The Shah actually had to import oil because they started running out. Due to the work stoppages. I remember when the Shah would come on to give a speech at night to get everybody to calm down and promise reforms or whatever, the electrical workers would suddenly shut off power. And they're there, and no one would hear them. There was all sorts of ways that the society mobilized that were made it clear that the status quo could not continue. And also I should mention there's a lot of alternative institutions. There's a lot of mutual aid. That people. One interesting factor is that, and this happened in Sudan as well, in a very impressive way, that there would be popular committees that would, because if you're going to basically stop recognizing the government, and a lot of people are dependent on the government for things, you do need to do things that would everything from collecting trash to care for the elderly. There are a lot of things that these popular grassroots committees could do and mobilize, and saying, hey, you don't need the government to do these things, that we can do it ourselves, and a more democratic system can indeed work. Because in certain ways the Iranian regime the Islamic regime has been, if you look at some statistics about the number of people receiving education, getting electricity into rural areas, a lot of as screwed up as the economy is on certain levels, in other levels the regime has improved the lives on certain ways of some Iranians. And some people might say, oh my God, we still need to have this government. No, No, people can mobilize themselves on a and show that alternative institutions can indeed work.
Mm-hmm. And then just I guess a final question for me is, given the role that young women have been playing in this recent upsurge of resistance, given everything that you know, Stephen, what would be your message to the young women and the young people generally in Iran that appear to be at the forefront of this revolutionary movement?
I'm reticent to give advice because only the people there really know the situation well enough. When I have done workshops on strategic nonviolent action, I refrained from giving specific advice. I talk about what other struggles have done in history. I talk about the theory and dynamics, why it works, how it works, and things like that. But the people who are there in the front lines, know much more than I do in terms of the local political context and how to respond to them. But the more general things that I would say is again, diversify the nonviolent tactics, including some lower risk ones. Develop alternative institutions of some kind. Maintain nonviolent discipline. Be aware there are going to be martyrs. There's going to be setbacks. It could be a protracted struggle. But I think the key thing is to think, okay, what keeps the regime in power? What are the elements? You can say the religious hierarchy, the Revolutionary Guard, the certain economic interests. You can kind of sort of do an analysis of like what is keeping the regime in power. Okay, how do you weaken those pillars of support? So you might think of it as, say, let's say, if you visualize kind of a Greco-Roman temple, where the base is the people, the roof, the top, that's the regime, and the pillars of support are what's keeping it up. You don't have to knock down all the pillars for it to collapse. You can just knock down one or two, or even just weaken them somewhat, and then it'll collapse. So you had some mention the media, of course. Here's a way of another way of putting alternative media or infiltrating the media there's so sort of do an analysis. What are the key things that keep the regime in power, and what can we do to target those things and weaken them? So and again, I can't tell you what the Iranians what these are. They know better than I do. But that would be the probably single most important piece of advice that I would give.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I think very helpful to everyone viewing. So thank you very much. Banafsheh, do you want to have a closing word and then tell us about tomorrow?
Yeah, I think your advice is just brilliant, Stephen. This is so helpful, I'm sure, to the freedom fighters in Iran. But just to go back to the comparison that was made between the 1978-79 revolution and this one, it's not very clear to people what exactly happened then. But the people who were mobilizing the masses were using ideology. They were using Islam. They were using, they were portraying the government of Shah as the enemy of Islam in a way. Yeah. And they committed many atrocities that then they blamed on the Shah's regime during the uprising. And that was very key. And it really, most of it were lies. They, for example, burned down a theater in Abadan filled with 300 some people. And this was the action of the Islamists, and they blamed it on Shah's regime. Yeah. And there was no opportunity for that regime to come clear and say we weren't responsible for this. So the regime is the people who, have given rise to this regime, like you said, are very aware of those kind of tactics. So they portray the opposition as the violent ones, as the ones who are disrupting the lives of ordinary people.
Yeah.
So and the protesters, the freedom fighters are aware of that.
Yeah, I acknowledge that, but I think it's important to think that the initial revolution against the Shah was much more broad based. I mean, there are certainly those who are motivated by the cassette tapes sent in by Ayatollah Khomeini and others, but the uprising did include liberals, leftists, quite a few others. But again, they ended up being outmaneuvered.
They were the mobilizers, actually.
Yeah. They were ended up being outmaneuvered, and a lot of people were kind of naive, I think, frankly, about what the reactionary Islamists would do. Once the Shah took once the Shah was ousted. So we can. There's still lessons on some specific tactics we can learn from that period, but again, I don't want to overextend to the analogy, obviously, because for some of the very reasons that you that you mentioned.
Yeah. But thank you again. Thank you so much. This has been so helpful, and I'm sure people will watch this over and over again. The way you guided us through the example of Sudan. I think it's very, very important. So again, we're very grateful to you.
Well, my pleasure. And I just wanted to just share how moved I am and how inspired the people of Iran and what they're doing. They're not just doing it for themselves; they're doing it for all the peoples of the world who are seeking freedom and justice. And it's just been so inspiring. It's been heartbreaking, of course, to see the casualties, but it's also extraordinarily inspiring.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your support, for your heartfelt support. In addition to what you've shared, the practical tools. So everyone, thank you again for joining us in this third day of looking at the liberation movement in Iran. Thank you for holding the certainty, the light of certainty that the people will triumph and overthrow this government. Tomorrow's session that I hope you will join will feature V, formerly known as Eve Ensler. V and I will dialogue with Jim about what is happening in Iran and amplify the voices of the freedom fighters in Iran, sharing with you some of what they're saying, what they want, and what they're experiencing. I will share some of the amazing art, some of the incredible creativity that has emerged in this time through music, through graphics. And so I hope that you will join us tomorrow. Jim?
Thank you, Banafsheh. And again, Stephen, beautiful insights and an inspiring analysis. So really thank you for that. It's so important to understand context and understand history within the framework of possibility. And you've provided that. So I just want to acknowledge you once again and thank you. So that'll bring our program to a close, everyone. Tomorrow we'll have our fourth of 5 sessions on the revolutionary moment that is seizing Iran. You're all welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat box. And we'll see everyone same time, same station tomorrow for the discussion with V on how the women are leading this revolution.